Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to Dad Return format before the emergency banning of Dimension Fusion and taking a look at Dad DDT. This was really the very last time the DDT was a playable deck in the TCG. There are iterations of Dad decks with Monster Gain and Reasoning that utilized DDR, but DDR and Dimension Fusion are on two completely different stratospheres in terms of power level. And unfortunately, when the emergency bannings took place right before the national season, DDT decks were put off to the side. But for one last final hurrah, we are going to take a look at Dad DDT. This is the deck that Chris Perovic piloted at SJC Costa Mesa to a top 2 finish. He lost to Lazaro Bolito, piloting your more traditional Dad Return deck. Chris was obviously well known for his DDT iterations. There was the version after Airblade when Stratos and D-Fusion were originally limited to 1, which he piloted to a second place finish at SJC Houston. There was the version that he piloted to a top 16 finish at SJC Washington at the start of the following format, where instead of utilizing triple malicious, he had to cut it down to 2 due to the semi-limitation, combine cards like Return from the Different Dimension into the strategy, and basically rebuilt a DDT variant. Then there's this version where we're going to incorporate Dark Armed Dragon and totally revamp what the deck looks like. Malicious is still semi-limited, so we're actually not going to be playing that at all, which is a little bit different than any of the earlier versions of DDT we've profiled. And instead, we're going to incorporate cards like Destiny Hero Plasma, which might not necessarily seem like it slots in really well in this strategy. But if you combine Destiny Hero Plasma with Monster Gate and Reasoning, you have a card that's just immediately skipped over and allowing you to continually push through your deck until you actually hit a monster that can be normal summoned. Why that is especially powerful is it actually fuels your graveyard for Dark Armed Dragon. It also fuels your graveyard for Divine Sword Phoenix Blade. So one Monster Gate, one Reasoning can actually not only result in a monster on the field theoretically for free or close to it, it also can fuel the graveyard with everything that you would possibly need to win, whether that's Dark Monsters, Warrior Monsters, Divine Sword, Warrior Monsters, and Dark Monsters, or a combination thereof. You also get to utilize some interesting card choices like Monster Reincarnation, because not only does Plasma get skipped over by Reasoning and Monster Gate, so does Dark Armed Dragon. So you actually can recur it back to your hand with a copy of Monster Reincarnation, a card that you both can activate by naturally drawing it, but also recur through cards like Dark Magician of Chaos and Magical Stone Excavation. You combine that with the power of soon-to-be-banned Dimension Fusion, and you have to yourself Dad DDT. Very similar, big picture to what the DDT strategies from the previous years were trying to do, but very different. A deck that honestly really just tries to win on the first turn. Not that DDT decks didn't want to do that earlier, but this deck really has that ability. We're also going to see a bigger emphasis placed on Elemental Hero Stratos as an opening play. Not that earlier versions of the DDT didn't necessarily want to open Stratos, but when you open Stratos with this particular deck, and we're going to make a lot of concessions with double Rhoda, double E emergency call, it not only puts a monster on the field, it gives you a target for Monster Gate, something that's not as natural without the Destiny Hero Malicious package. But in addition to that, it also pulls whether it's a Diamond Dude or Dasher out of the deck, and then all of a sudden a deck that only has 6 Monster Gate / Reasoning targets can very quickly go down to 4 when Stratos and its search target are removed, leaving us with whether it's Diamond Dude, or Diamond Dude plus Dash, it kind of depends what you Stratos, Jinzo and Dark Magician of Chaos, only 4 monsters, which means Monster Gate and Reasoning is much more likely to hit 8, 9, 10, maybe even more spells along the way, or potentially Dark Monsters that cannot be normal, especially like Dark Arm Return, or Dark Arm specifically, and Destiny Hero Plasma. As a result, by emphasizing the importance of Stratos on the opening turn, it sets you up to utilize a Monster Gate Reasoning where sometimes all it takes is 1 to win the game. Seeing as how you could naturally draw Diffusion, you can have naturally drawn Magical Stone Excavation, you could just hit Dark Magician of Chaos, which when you Monster Gate, you have a 1 in 4 chance of doing when there's only 4 targets left in your deck. When you do that opening play Stratos, it really makes the ceiling of this deck much, much higher. So we're going to see some deck choice decisions that might seem weird on the surface, like E-Emergency Call with only 1 Elemental Hero in the deck. But when you put it all together, you're really trying to harness the power of Dark Arm with Diffusion, with Reasoning and Monster Gate, and the speed of this deck, when you're really trying to compete against other decks that can OTK very quickly. Dad Return has obviously always been known as a very explosive deck, and by really trying to harness the power of the DDT strategy with Dark Arm, you're trying to be the first to OTK, something that Chris was able to do all the way up into the finals. But nevertheless, let's take our second deep dive look at DDT, but our very first deep dive look at Dad DDT. All right, we'll start the deck profile off with the Destiny Hero package, which I think is the most important engine in the deck. We have 3 copies of Destiny Hero Plasma. We're basically never summoning Plasma. Instead, we're using it as a Destiny draw, a Lair of Darkness, Stratos target that also is just skipped through Monster Gate and Reasoning, fueling our graveyard with Dark Monsters to eventually summon Dark Armed Dragon. Then we have 2 copies of Diamond Dude. Diamond Dude is one of those cards where if you happen to not win on the first turn, or you just go first, it does give you a reasonable normal summon because there's so many powered normal spells in this deck. Where if you survive that opening turn, it almost guarantees that if you hit a good normal spell that you're going to be able to win on the following turn. It's also just a warrior, which this deck needs. It just needs warriors in the deck to use Divine Sword Phoenix Blade. It also gives us additional targets for Allure of Darkness and Destiny Draw. And then we have a single copy of Dasher. So Dasher is an interesting card in DDT decks in general. It might not seem like a very important piece, but if you play this strategy enough, you'll start to realize there's a lot of games where the ability to equip the Divine Sword to Dasher and then tribute Dasher with its own effect, which is something that you were able to do back in the day, is really important because it puts Divine Sword into the graveyard, but it also allows you to put another warrior in the graveyard. In addition to that, if you Dimension Fusion out a Dark Magician of Chaos, you can bring back the Defusion with Dark Magician of Chaos and then tribute it off of Dasher to boost it to 31, and then Dark Magician of Chaos gets banished, and then you can use Defusion either immediately just to bring this back, or later in the turn after you refuel the banished pile. So Dasher is just one of those cards that's really important. It also can sometimes help manipulate the Dark count for Dark Arm Dragon, which in a version of this deck that has Dark Arm Dragon is also an important piece. So Dasher is just one of those cards that the more you play DDT strategies, the more you realize it ends up coming in clutch because there's just not many cards that facilitate what it's able to do. Then we, of course, have Stratos that I referenced earlier, going along with our 2 copies of Diamond Dude, 3 Plasmas, and Dasher. From that point on, we have the 2 big monsters that you basically always see in DDT strategies, Dark Magician of Chaos and Jinzo. We already profiled DDT, so I'm not going to go too in-depth here, but Dark Magician of Chaos is just crazy because you can bring back Defusion, which is the deck's basically win condition. You also can bring back a bunch of singleton cards like Lightning Vortex, Brain Control, Monster Reborn, even Monster Reincarnation to revive Dark Arm Dragon. So it's really pivotal that you access it in some capacity. It's one of the main reasons why this deck was as good as it was. Then we have 2 copies of Dark Arm Dragon. So this is sort of the budget Dark Arm deck at the time, which sounds crazy because Dark Arm during this format was about $300 or pretty close to 3 for 1,000, depending on whether or not you found yourself with a good deal. But this deck only really needed 2. It can access it a little bit easier than other decks because yes, you can just naturally draw it, but you have Monster Reincarnation, and if you mill Dark Arm Dragon or Destiny Hero Plasma off Reasoning or Monster Gate, it actually just skips through them, which means when you activate Reasoning or Monster Gate, you technically only have 6 monsters that can be hit. As a result, you're more reliably going to churn through your deck. You're potentially going to hit 5 dark monsters that just go immediately to the graveyard. And sometimes you can hit the singleton one-ofs like Defusion or Monster Reincarnation and make it so that if you do eventually get access to Dark Magician of Chaos, you have this just medley of great choices, whether it's a Defusion, Reincarnation out of Dark Arm Dragon. You have all of these options when you actually get to recur a spell. And as a result, it gives this deck that real flexibility of turboing through the deck, but having this wide array of possible targets to recur off Dark Magician of Chaos. But Dark Arm Dragon is really awesome in this deck because you can manipulate the Dark count really easily. Between Divine Sword, Phoenix Blade, Monster Reincarnation, Monster Reborn, this deck can manipulate its Dark count as much as it possibly needs to in order to summon Dark Arm Dragon. So we have 2 copies of Dark Arm. For the spell lineup, we have the draw power that basically all the Dark Arm decks got to play, which is 3 Destiny Draw and 3 copies of Allure. We have plenty of targets for both of these, probably more than your traditional deck. We're not playing Malicious. I should have actually pointed that out earlier. This deck doesn't necessarily need Malicious because it's limited to 2. And as a result of it being limited to 2, the upside isn't as high as it may be in earlier versions. We also just want to have as few targets off of Monster Gate and Reasoning as possible. We basically always want to make it such that when you get to access either of those 2 cards, you flip over as many monsters as possible and as many spells as possible, right? We want to be able to hit all 5 of these and only have 6 potential targets, sometimes even less. I'll talk about that momentarily. As a result, we don't play Destiny Hero Malicious, but we do have plenty of targets for the 3 Destiny Draw and the 3 copies of Allure of Darkness. Then we have, for sort of the turbo cards that make this deck as good as it is, we have 3 copies of Monster Gate and 3 copies of Reasoning. You want to see one of these as fast as possible. As I alluded to earlier, there are only 6 targets in the deck, so we have a high reliability of hitting a bunch of good spells, hopefully Divine Sword Phoenix Blade, and hopefully fueling the deck or the graveyard with dark monsters. One of the cards that's really important in this strategy, and it might not necessarily seem like it, is Reinforcements of the Army and E-Emergency Call. There's literally only 1 target in the deck for E-Emergency Call, then technically there's more targets for Rhoda, but it's really always just going to be used to summon Stratos. Why having access to Stratos on the opening turn is so important is you get to tutor out of your deck a Diamond Dude or a Dasher. Why that's pivotal is if you were able to do that, and let's say for the sake of discussion you search Diamond Dude, now there's only 4 targets in your entire deck for Monster Gate and Reasoning, which means there's a huge likelihood of you hitting 7, 8, 9 spells, potentially fueling the graveyard by hitting some of these, potentially hitting the 1 single copy of Defusion. By using 1 Stratos and taking out the other warrior from your deck, you get to consistently fuel your Divine Sword by getting access to 2 warriors, but you also get to fuel your Allure, Darkness, and Destiny Drum. But in addition to that, you make Reasoning and Monster Gate as powerful as humanly possible. So that's really one of the awesome strategies. And if you search a Diamond Dude and your opponent has this when you're Reasoning, chances are they're going to call 8 because that's the level that everyone's afraid of. You have a nice wide array of potential targets, a 4, 2 6s, and an 8. And if they want to call 6, you're totally fine with that because hitting either of these is great. So Stratos plus 2 Rotas plus E-Emergence Go, we basically have 5 copies in a 40-card deck. Then we have some Magical Stone Excavations, which are pretty classic cards in DDT strategies. We want to be able to bring back Defusion as much as possible. Having access to Magical Stone is pivotal because it ditches warriors from our hand. It brings back Divine Sword, or ditches Divine Sword and allows us to bring back Divine Sword by ditching warriors. It's really an awesome piece. The 2 discards isn't really that big of a deal when a lot of the cards you want are in the graveyard anyway. And it's also one of those cards that allow you to access some of the singleton 1-ups that make this strategy so potent. We have only 2 copies of Divine Sword Phoenix Blade. This deck doesn't have an exorbitant amount of warriors, and you really only need access to 1. Some of the early versions of this deck, maybe you needed to have multiple copies in order to really fuel the Banish pile. Between Allure, Dark Arm Dragon, and then even just 1 single copy, you have plenty to fuel your Banish pile. Way more than enough than necessary, so having only 2 copies is totally fine, and it reduces the likelihood of drawing multiple, which isn't the greatest thing in the world. If you do draw them, here are some things you need to know about DDT strategy. Sometimes it's correct just to equip this to a warrior and then use Monster Gate to guarantee that this goes to the graveyard, especially when you only play 2 copies. The worst thing that you could possibly see is just have this dead in your hand without a warrior to activate it on, without a card like Magical Stone to put it to the graveyard. Because in order to fuel the Banish pile for Dimension Fusion and actually win the game, you do need to put this into the graveyard in some capacity. So it's correct many times just to equip a warrior and then use Monster Gate. In addition to the Divine Swords, we have a bunch of singleton 1-ups. We have Heavy Storm, because it's Heavy Storm. It's a format where, honestly, I usually just activate Heavy Storm because I never want my opponents to use Return because they're probably going to win if they get to use Return on their turn. So singleton copy of Heavy Storm. Only 1 copy of Lightning Vortex, which is interesting because this strategy is typically well known for having 3 copies. With this particular strategy right now, you need to be wary that when you Defusion, it is possible for your opponent to have a pretty robust Banish pile because that's just the nature of the format. But between Dark Arm Dragon and Lightning Vortex and the ability to recur Vortex through Dark Magician to Chaos and Magical Stone Excavation, it's pretty reasonable that you'll be able to crack the opponent's board after Defusion and then outright win the game. You definitely want to just outright win the game from there because if you pass the opponent, they'll probably kill you back. But having an access point like this and even just a singleton copy is useful because this deck, because it mills so much through Monster Gate and Reasoning, there's a pretty reasonable chance that you end up getting access to Lightning Vortex at some point in the game. Then we have Monster Reborn and Monster Reincarnation, which is an interesting 2 inclusions here, plus Premature Burial that kind of fits along with that. We'll start with Reincarnation because it's a card you don't typically see in Dark Arm strategies. Why Reincarnation is so cool is when you mill Dark Arm Dragon through Monster Gate and Reasoning, you can actually just recur it back to your hand through Reincarnation and then special summon it. Sometimes you actually hit Dark Magician to Chaos and bring back the Reincarnation and then use that to summon Dark Arm, and all of a sudden you have 2 28s on the field and you're pretty close to just outright winning even without using Dimension Fusion, which is just an awesome access point with this deck. Reincarnation can also sometimes manipulate your Dark Count if necessary, right? If you have Dark Arm in your hand, 4 Darks in the grave, Reincarnation puts 1 back to your hand, and all of a sudden you're back to 3 Darks, so it's pretty cool in that sense too. Reborn and Premature Burial give you ways of special summoning back out Dark Magician to Chaos. It technically can recur your opponent's Disc Commander 2 with Monster Reborn, very important, just part of that format in general. But definitely with this particular strategy, if your opponent calls 8 off Reasoning, you still want to be able to recur your Dark Magician to Chaos once it hits the graveyard. It cannot be banished with Divine Sword, though it can be banished with Dark Arm Dragon. It is something to consider. There is only 1 Defusion plus the 2 stones, so maybe you can't necessarily always recur it out of the banish pile, but the deck at least has the ability to do so. Having these give us additional ways of bringing Dark Magician to Chaos back, which is one of the pivotal cards in actually winning the game. Then we have 2 cards that facilitate Monster Gate really well, which is Scapegoats and Brain Control. Because this deck doesn't have Malicious, it can't do that classic D-draw Malicious Monster Gate play. It really needs to get access to Stratos on the opening turn, which is why we're playing 4 copies, so that we can just Monster Gate Stratos. In addition to that, Brain Control and Scapegoat give us additional ways of Monster Gating. Scapegoat also has a backdoor way of summoning Plasma if it's necessary. Plasma is worth pointing out because technically, if you get Plasma over 2800 attack, there's basically no outs in any of the Dark Arm decks to a Plasma over 2800, which is basically anything stronger than a Stratos. And if you at least put Stratos on it, your opponent has to crash into it because the 900 that you would get off a Stratos would bring this up to a 28. What I mean by 28 is Dark Magician to Chaos, Dark Lord Zerato, and Dark Arm Dragon is really the attack threshold in the format. So if you're ever in a position where you take a Jinzo or you take something like a Dasher, this goes over the 2800 attack threshold. And besides maybe Lightning Vortex and the Mirror Match, the traditional Dark Arm decks do not have an out to this, minus maybe Crush Card Virus, but at Costa Mesa, that was a prize card. That card wouldn't be mass released until later on in the format. So it is something worth noting that, yeah, Plasma is there typically just as a piece to go through with Monster Gate and Reasoning and a draw target off Destiny Drop and Allure of Darkness. There is a backdoor where you actually summon it, and something that you definitely need to consider if you play the strategy. We have one single copy of Card Destruction because, with Divine Sword, sometimes we can get pretty reasonable card destruction when you bounce these to hand and get to discard a bunch of cards. It's also one of those decks where if your opening hand's not good enough and you card destruction, chances are your second iteration will be good enough. And then there's our primary win condition, which is the single copy of Defusion. I don't want to say this deck abused it more than others because there was actual FTKs that were pretty consistent that used Defusion as its win condition with spell economics. But this deck definitely accessed it more than your traditional Dark Arm deck. So I would say in comparison to that deck, this deck is the one that used it the best. In terms of the format, you have, of course, the Mirror Match, which we'll use a Monster Gate to represent. The other Dark Arm deck that we're afraid of is just sort of the traditional Dark Arm strategy. I'll use a Disc Commander to represent that, whether it's with Destiny Heroes or even just Disc Commander. Even if you didn't play D-Draw, they often just play Disc Commander because it works so well with Monster Reborn and Dark Magician of Chaos. But we have those two Destiny Hero decks. I think that's tier 0, at least with these two decks competing at the top with the Dark Arm strategies. If you really had to play something anti-meta, there was FTKs that I don't think were all that great in retrospect, but were still pretty consistent and pretty popular, and they had some pretty decent results. I never won a YCS, but they definitely did pretty well. They ended up getting second place at an SJC at the time. They would sporadically top during the events, so it's definitely worth pointing out that there were some FTK strategies which we'll eventually profile. There's, of course, Gladiator Beast without Geysera, so a super anti-meta deck with main deck copies of Shadow Imprisoning Mirror. Paul Levitin won a YCS or an SJC at the time in Minnesota with that strategy, so it's definitely worth noting as sort of a secondary anti-meta strategy and sort of a budget strategy if you didn't want to buy Dark Arm Dragon. And then there were some, I don't think it was very good, but Six Samurai was sort of the ultimate budget deck because you didn't need either Dark Arm Dragon or Herc. You could just play sort of the traditional Six Samurai monsters. And Great Shogun Sheen is pretty decent into a format where there's a lot of spell cards. Other things to note, you could maybe throw cards like Gadgets and even other anti-meta like Macrocosmos-based strategies, but I really don't think those decks were very good. To me, this was a borderline tier 0 format where whether it's Dark Arm or Dark Arm with DDT being the top two decks. In terms of how we're going to counter this, we have 2 copies of Great Shogun Sheen ourselves. Your opponent's never going to call 7 off of Reasoning, and then Monster Gated obviously is always going to hit. As a result, we have a way of sort of backdooring into a card that basically locks out the FTK strategies and is very difficult for DDT to deal with. So it's a pretty awesome inclusion in this particular strategy. We have a single copy of Snipe Hunter as an access point to counteracting cards like Royal Oppression or some of the other floodgates that your opponent might play in some of the super anti-meta strategies. We also have a copy of Exiled Force. Exiled Force is a good card against Great Shogun Sheen and some of the other type of lockdown monsters like Haiku that you can encounter. It's also an easy inclusion with 2 copies of Reinforcements of the Army. It's also a warrior for Divine Sword, and it's something you can actually bring back off of Defusion. Some of the early versions of DDT often just included this because of those flexibilities. Then for the spell lineup, an interesting spell that Chris elected to play was 2 copies of Messenger of Peace and a single copy of Swords of Prevailing Light. Theoretically, your opponent should side out their back row destruction because this deck literally plays 0 traps. As a result, if you can stick any of these, which you can recur off recur off of Magical Stone Excavation and Dark Magician of Chaos, you can actually just get these into the mid to late game and actually just lock your opponent out for a few turns until you draw an OTK. So it's an interesting inclusion in the sense that your opponent really probably should be siding out Heavy Storm. I will say, at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, the knowledge that maybe is more accessible today wasn't as universal. So I don't think people naturally would consider siding out Heavy Storm, but they really should against this strategy. But there are 3 stall cards, and then 2 mass removal cards with a Giant Trunade and a second copy of Lightning Vortex. Giant Trunade's pretty good into the back row deck, some of the anti-meta strategies that might exist. Same thing is true with cards like Royal Decree. This deck has 0 traps in it, so we can easily run Royal Decree. We also have some other cards. We have Threatening Roar, which is an interesting one in the mirror match. You do have to sometimes preemptively activate this in fear of Jinzo, but if you get to buy yourself another turn and guarantee that you yourself get to use Defusion, because this deck doesn't have negates or anything, you can probably win the game. You just have to fear your opponent having Shogun Sheen, I guess, in the mirror match. But there's Threatening Roar. You can use it against other really aggressive dad strategies as well. Then we have just a couple generic cards. We have Torrential Tribute, which can be pretty good against some of the anti-meta strategies, and a Mind Crush, which can be pretty good against the Spell Economics, Defusion, OTK-based or FTK-based strategies, where if you do get to go first, you can lock out the Defusion when they add it back to the hand of Dark Magician of Chaos. And if they don't have another way of getting Dark Magician of Chaos into the banished pile or recurring it or use Magical Stone Excavation, sometimes you can lock out the opponent who thinks they're in the middle of an FTK with a single copy of Mind Crush. But nevertheless, that's Joe Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.